Welcome to Nourishing the Mother, an inspired conversation space between Bridget Wood and Julie Tenner on the journey of motherhood through the common thread of parenting, relationship, and sexuality as a path to consciousness.
We keep our conversations honest, our experiences real, and our philosophies exploratory. We believe that in order to raise incredible humans, we first have to raise ourselves. We know that in order to rock the family, you've got to nourish the mother. If you are here, you care about paving a path of conscious and intentional motherhood, connected with yourself and your gifts, and also illuminating your children in theirs so we may raise more whole humans who can impact this world in a more humane way.
If you desire to integrate your learnings practically and supportively, head on over to bridgetwood.life or julietenner.love to go deeper. And for all live-streamed pre-release podcasts and all our free content, head over to our free Facebook group, Nourishing the Mother with Bridget Wood and Julie Tenner. We are Julie Tenner and Bridget Wood, and we are so grateful you're here.
Hello and welcome to Nourishing the Mother. I'm Bridget Wood.
And I'm Julie Tenner. And today's podcast is Isolation and Loneliness, Part 2. And the reason we decided to do a Part 2 was because we jumped off that conversation and went, there was this whole piece we didn't feel like we got to talking about. So that's where we want to dive a little bit deeper and look more at identity and our own experiences of isolation and loneliness in motherhood that perhaps you can resonate with or see yourself in, and hopefully find some light in how to move forwards for yourself. So before we do that, we'd love to remind you to jump onto nourishingthemother.com.au, scroll on down to the red banner, drop in your email address, and we will make sure that we keep you in the loop with what we've got going on, so you are a click away from being able to dive deeper where your heart desires. So nourishingthemother.com.au.
I do. You cannot have any conversation, I think, about that overwhelming sense of isolation and loneliness, particularly in early motherhood, without addressing identity. And this is just something that I think I completely missed in my own experience of being a first-time mother, because it's just never really something that you get your hand held through, right? Like this rite of passage that is...
Actually even spoken about.
Or even spoken about, yeah, exactly. I mean, handheld would be nice. Spoken about would be just the basics, you'd think. But,
right.
I mean, I think we all certainly have that intuitive sense that we're moving to, across a threshold. And I know I wrote about it at the time, I sensed it. But without something holding you in it, it can just feel like you're being consumed. And everything that you thought you were, you maybe try to claw at, but it's not you. It's hard to touch into that person anymore because you're transformed. You can't be that. You can't be her. And I mean, I certainly remember when I went back to my corporate work, and, it was like you go back to the same job and you have your same cubicle and you kind of pick up some of the tasks that you were doing. And it's just like, oh, hey, like Bridget's back. And you're like, I don't know.
Who's Bridget?
Well, I don't know who you think I am now, because I'm not the person who left. Because you always have one foot in your mothering and one foot in this sense of the identity that you're creating for yourself. And certainly if you're on this conscious parenting path, who you are as a mother deeply influences who you are as a woman. So I really want to give space to just acknowledging that as a transition.
Well, I think it's the weirdest kind of twilight experience, isn't it? Because you don't look externally like you've changed.
Not at all.
Despite the fact, of course, you had a belly and then you don't. But other than that, there's no outward sign that seems to signal to the world, I've just changed. I've just gone through something massive. That at other points of transition or rites of passage, we might otherwise have menarche, puberty, marriage, death, extreme illness, loss of limbs or ability, like very external measures that the rest of the world can kind of grasp onto or have a window that says, I can meet you in your change because I'm sure that's where you're at. Whereas motherhood, it doesn't seem to be recognized as something deep and transformative, potentially filled with grief and pain and suffering and isolation and loneliness, despite the fact that she could be in a room of people and have someone around her every day. Right? Like, we don't acknowledge that because we're supposed to be so happy about the blessing of the baby. So I just see that women get really lost, which is what I hear you speaking about, in that it's been such an enormous psychological shift, and yet nowhere is that recognized for them outside of themselves, and potentially they don't know that either.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, they don't know that either, and it's not recognized outside of themselves because our structure of motherhood is largely defined by the patriarchy, and our structure of work is masculine generally, unless you're in more of a caregiving or caring or nurturing kind of role or a creative role. But if you have come from the world of the 9 to 5, then that is not an embodied feminine experience, and mothering and birth take you perhaps to the most embodied feminine experience you've ever had in your life. And so you're asking yourself to try to fit into something that can't really see that experience or give that experience any kind of reverence, which is what you often need in order to integrate it.
Yeah, totally. So it's this identity shift and this, which is what we touched on last week's podcast, but that we wanted to string and tease out a little bit because we didn't feel like we were as concise as we could be, because we kind of talked around it, but not specifically, because we talked around the concepts of needing to validate your own experience and see you first. And you can't ask the outside world to give you something that you're not giving you, and that the sense of isolation and loneliness, even when, and particularly in that particular listener's case who was writing the letter, and look, I don't even know if she was talking collectively about her friends or if it was herself, but let's say it's the experience of, I have care 3 days a week and I have mother's group 1 day a week, so I'm around people 4 days a week. And she's still experiencing what feels like, I don't know what the word is, a deep or a sludgy or a hard, phase of isolation and loneliness. And she's like, what is this and how do we move through that? And we talked about it in terms of you can't ask externally for something you're not giving yourself. True. But where we wanted to take this was also the step beyond that, which is when you are surrounded by people and you've got, in inverted commas, all of the privileges that you should be happy with and you're not. It's because you're still looking for you.
I have the most potent, as you said that, I have the most potent memory dropping in of me walking to the train station, and it was like my son must have been like maybe just over a year old, and it was just as I'd first gone back to work, and I remember like walking on the street and like just crossing the corner and had this like sense of like overwhelming grief, but also that the should that says, but like I have everything, like I should just be happy with this. Like what is this deep gaping hole in me right now?
Yeah.
And that's what I couldn't put words to then, which is this clawing at some semblance of self when you're so deeply, I think in love with your child and in love with being their mother, but also knowing that there's more to you than that. But you still don't know who that is or what that is or how to even see and claim that, let alone the world see that.
Totally. I mean, you between the two of us that are most recently closer to, I mean, I know Pearl's nearly 2, but Gwen's nearly 4. So I also want to say this, listener. I know this is the most cliche thing you could ever possibly hear, but I promise it does get easier too.
Yeah.
That, yes, the same degree of challenge exists. Yes, you know, you're just changing nappies for defiant teens or whatever. Like, it's not that the construct of parenting, I think, that the pressure or the transformation or the process you go through lessen. They don't. But what does change is the amount of personal space that you have, and how much your body is your own, and how much they want to be on their own as opposed to with you. Those things change enormously as children grow. You know, by 2, they're starting to do that. By 3, it's really more of a walk in the park. And by 4, pretty easy by then. They're doing a lot of stuff in their day on their own.
Yes, except the triggers can get harder depending on, you know, your own story, obviously.
Yeah, but I'm not saying the degree changes, but personal, yeah. So you start to find more pockets of you because you have more time to find you. You have more time to do the work in the world that you want to do, or serve the community that you want to serve, or do the art that you want to do, just by virtue of the fact you don't have a Klingon Velcro child on you. Not to say that you're not going to be dealing with tantrums, you are, but that's very different to 24/7 you're on my body.
Yes, or, you know, 24/7 you're kind of ruling my day. Like, you know,
you always have needs. It's like 10 minutes and that's all you get. Yeah. And I remember that. It's like you never get, like, every 10 minutes, like, look, Mom, whatever, I need a drink. Can you get the thing? I'm hungry. You know, like, every 10 minutes. I don't, like, that's almost like psychological torture if you don't have a bigger vision for that.
It's so true. That's such a great way to explain it, because, I mean, even as you're talking, I was thinking, yeah, like, what are those monotonous things? And yes, the mum is one. Yes, maybe the changing nappies constantly might be another. And for those things, when I can notice that an edge is coming up for me around it feeling overwhelming, or around it feeling like I'm feeling resentful, or I'm feeling suffocated by it, for me, I often ask, how can I make this meaningful? Like, how can I make this something that I want to do, or something that I can expand into rather than tolerate? And even changing nappies for one of the things where I think this is a beautiful example, or beautiful invitation to give deep care and to teach consent, and to have a conversation with my child rather than do something to them that I know stacks up and is really aligned with my values. So that then changes it from being just this thing I have to do and get done to something meaningful for me. And so I find that helpful, like, when we're hitting those places. And so the same thing can be with that constant mom, like, okay, well, how do I turn this into something that I can be open to and find joy in, dare I say. I mean, you're not going to find joy in with all of it, and I don't think it's particularly helpful when you hear older like ladies say, oh, just like soak up and enjoy every minute, when you often can't do that realistically, right? We're going to swing from, like, being infatuated with our child and resenting them.
But I also hear, I'm fascinated by the experience of grandparents too. As you know, I've always been fascinated by the experience of grandparents because I didn't really have them growing up. I only knew one of my 4 grandparents, and she was fairly distant and not someone that we ever spent very much time with at all. So largely I kind of feel like I didn't grow up with grandparents. My husband, on the other hand, grew up with, like, comes from, this is where I think it's so interesting to look at your lineage, right? The patterns of your family. So I'm from generations of motherless mothers. And so, you know, grandparentless grandchildren. Like, there's just this motherless, parentless pattern that I can see through my mother line. And through my father's line, really super absent. But when I look at my husband's line, super involved parents, super involved grandparents, generationally. So I kind of have always had a fascination, as you know, I've always known family's chocolatey, despite the fact I haven't always wanted to own that because I had so many labels on what that meant. But I have been fascinated for years, like a creeper, you know, kind of like a peeping Tom, watching my friends, even growing up, that had or appeared to have these really well-rounded, intimate family relationships. Like I used to observe them. I can remember doing it at even like
how do they do that?
Yeah, right. And literally asking them, how does this work? And then as a teenager, literally gathering the evidence. How do they do that? How does their family work? How often do you guys go away? What do you think the secrets are? I would literally, through my whole life, I've asked these questions.
I love that you have, because I've asked a similar version of question, or even just the memories that come in for me. Like, why was I so fascinated about that particular family, and why was I, you know, like, because it just shows you it is.
Yeah, right. That's kind of exciting. So I've always been fascinated by grandparents. Where was I going with this?
About what grandparents say about these.
Oh, yes, thank you. Thank you for bringing me around. And so I'm fascinated by the experience of grandparents, and what I have noticed in my, very subjective research / questioning of every grandparent I've ever seen is that it is a joyful experience and removes all of the drudgery and the suffering of parenting, and all you're left with is sheer joy.
Oh, isn't that beautiful?
And so when I think those older people say, oh my gosh, just cherish it, it's because they have this heart yearning to be back there. This is where I feel like I try and in my mind's eye snapshot my everyday monotony in some form, because one day I know I'm going to be that grandparent in the, nursing home who would want nothing more than to time travel and just sit in the lounge room of the house of buzzing children and people and everyone doing their own thing. We will miss the everyday. I won't want to go back to go to a, holiday to Paris. I'll want to go back just to be in the everyday connectivity that is my current reality, right? Like I can feel that yearning,
the mayhem,
and that desire to press pause on time. So one, that reminds me to take moments of deep presence when they come around, because I know I'll miss the everyday. I've been around death long enough and spoken to so many people crossing over enough times to know that is absolutely, like, they never miss the huge thing. What they miss is the tiniest of moments that blink and you'd miss it, right? But I think when the older generation people say, just relish every moment, I feel the mother rage in that as well, of being like, fuck you, because this is really hard. And that's so lovely that you just look at it with this rose-coloured, golden-lensed, vision. One day I'll be there. Yeah. Right now, I need you to see how hard it is, and please help me.
Yes.
Like, so I can see it both ways is more my point.
Yeah, I love that, because because you can, right? Like you can see where they're coming from, but also like
don't dismiss their experience.
Yeah.
And you should be so lucky. You should really take more time. You don't really have to be that blah, 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 whatever. And I just see it as so much shame in a lot of ways. I know it's coming from a place of nostalgia.
Yeah.
But it's very shame-inducing for the mother in the moment who's really struggling and yet again is not seen.
Yeah, and who often internalizes it as judgment, like particularly from the mother-in-law, for example.
Yeah.
Who perhaps has all of the right answers, or, thinks you should be doing things differently.
Yeah, totally. So I would just say that there will be a time at which you will be able to go slow, and it can, I think, include the nostalgia of your time with your children, and it can be in a gifting back of that to your grandchildren. So I also think don't shame yourself in the here and the now, because parenting is a totally different gig to grandparenting, and they forget.
Yeah. They do.
They really
unless they spend a lot of time like doing some parenting for you, and then they remember and are quite happy to go home to their, Quiet house.
Yeah. In actual fact, one of my son's assistant coaches is a grandparent. So my son is coached by a son-in-law and father-in-law team, and they're just divine. And they've moved back in so the couple who have little children have moved back in with her parents for a year to save money to build a house. And so I was speaking to the grandfather, who's the assistant coach, and I was like, my God, how is this experience for you? Because they're little, they're like 10 months and 3 or something, 2.5. And he was like, oh God, I just want to go back to being a grandparent. He's like, no, now I have to like discipline him and stuff. And it's like, I don't like it. I've done that already. I just want to enjoy him. And I'm not now. And I'm like, yes, this is the difference from parenting to grandparenting.
Yeah.
So I just really want to reflect that it doesn't have to be right now. It's coming from a good place. You will be able to pay it forwards when you are old. Just take tiny moments to take those Shutterstock, images in your own mind that you can return to. And I think that's, you're doing the best you can in any moment. And that is always enough. Always.
I love that reminder, because I've got a memory of, maybe must have been about, I think probably 2.5 years ago, and just having this overwhelming welling up of emotion as I was reading a book to our son and my husband was reading a book to our daughter, because we'd had 2 children then. And I had this overwhelming sense of like, oh my God, like this all ends. Like this all ends. And so it just was like this, you get those waves of realization sometimes, and it just helps you crystallize, I don't know, like just the sanctity of those simple moments.
Totally.
And it can really change your experience, of what hard feels like as well, when you can put that lens on it.
Totally. So I was trying to remember what a time at which my isolation and loneliness was at its worst. And I do think that it was with my first child. I think there's something about that first rite of passage, and depending on how well you integrate it or move through it will probably depend on how long that season of isolation and loneliness lasts for you, and whether you process through it in a way where you gather or collect along the way what you need to, or whether you repeat and find yourself back in isolation and loneliness with each child, because I don't think that it has to exist that way. Like, I know I have 4 children and life is busy, but I could still have 4 children and feel deeply lonely and isolated, and I don't. I've never felt more connected. I've never felt like I deeply, deeply, deeply love my own presence so much that I'm not ever lonely. Like, that sounds so like vomit. Even as I'm saying it, I'm like, oh God, Julie. But I think that's the difference, is that I really love who I've become, and I like spending time just with her. So even in that minutia, and because I think also having a child who's 15, it does make me realize how fast it is. And so it does make me hold on to that almost grandparent-like sense of preciousness with Gwen. So again, I don't feel lonely. I just feel in this bubble. So I find it hard to sometimes place myself back there, but I have definitely been there. I would also say now when I'm lonely, I check in with myself and go, oh, okay, I haven't made time to see friends because my social value actually sits relatively low on my hierarchy of values. So it's often a spinning plate that I forget about until I go, oh, I'm lonely. I have no friends and, no one's rung me. And then I'm like, oh, Julie, because you're not caretaking that value. So do you want to? And then I bring that plate forwards and I lock in, play dates or catch ups or coffees. And then I'm like, oh, I'm not lonely at all. In fact, I have too many friends to catch up with. So I just think sometimes it can be a bit of a value shift, as opposed to no one gets me, I don't have anyone. Oh, what you don't caretake of withers.
Yeah.
So do you want to...
And what you put focus on flourishes. So look for where you're flourishing. Like, look for something that is flourishing, because there will be something, because whatever we put energy to has to grow. And then go, okay, well, what would it be like to to also direct some of that flourishing kind of energy to the areas where I feel like I'm not. And sometimes it can be combining it too. Like even lately I've started training with boxing, and so it's like a mums and babies class, so I don't have to look for childcare or look for someone to take my kids, because they can be part of it. So I'm getting 3 values met. I'm getting presence with my kids, I'm getting my health and fitness met, and I'm getting social met. And so like that, 2 sessions of that just fills me up. And so it just means that there's not a lot of room for me to kind of collapse into that place of feeling isolated or feeling disconnected.
I actually like super love that, because this is actually the thing that I love the most, and I see the difference of, is how can you hack the system? Like, it doesn't have to be I'm in service to my children, can't do anything for myself, or I need someone who takes my children and then I get to do something for myself. If you live that way, you are sure to end up with a burnout.
Totally. 100%. And I think that that's actually where a lot of the resentment and overwhelm in motherhood comes from this sense of constantly feeling split in 2 directions. And this is also why you and I have really tried to focus on weaving our business within our motherhood, so it's not this thing. I mean, like we did a training this morning.
We don't work our motherhood around business. We work our business around our motherhood.
So like in Soul Driven Motherhood, you'll see me breastfeeding Pearl, or like, you know, one of our partners might pop in and check something, or, you know, it's just kind of how it has to roll, because that's what we choose. So we choose that life of integration like that.
Yeah, but even in the example you gave, it's not, oh crap, I don't have anyone who can look after my kids. I'm, not paying for childcare, so I can't exercise. You've gone, how can I exercise? Not I can't, how can I? And then you've found something where you get to be wholly and completely you, as mother, as woman, as, all of the things, and you're doing them all together. You will feel better, because the more things that you can do in one activity that tick more of your top values, actually the more energy you're going to be getting. Right.
Totally.
Like power packing. If you imagine that every top value of yours is like a power cord, and then you're choosing an activity where you're plugging in 3 power cords in one hit, that shit's going to give you energy faster than anything else.
It's like even just recently, Jules and I caught up, and our 2 girls, Gwen and Sylvie, love playing together, and so they actually set up this play date. Sylvie was like, I want to see Gwen.
Very good.
And so we set that up, and then you and
Which is actually great, Bridget, because I actually am pretty shit at social stuff, right? Because it's not a top value. So I actually need my kids to do that.
Thanks, kids, for fun. But it was great because the girls played and played and played and loved it, and you and I got to like chat and catch up in our friendship, and also talk work. And so like so many things got met in that intro.
The one totes.
So we can feel really fulfilled.
Exactly. So I really also just want to reflect that in this phase of isolation and loneliness too, is instead of I can't, I would ask, how can I? Because there's always a way. There's always a way. There's always a way. It's, it's just removing all of the barriers you have, or all of the attachments that you have to the form that it's supposed to be, in order to open up into what could actually be better for you, and a combination of all values rather than just 1 or 2.
Yeah, and I think this is creative thinking, right? Which we're not really schooled in. We're really shaped by our own schooling system and by our culture. It's like an either or. Like there's always has to be some kind of trade-off. But this is like, but what about the and this and this?
Yes, 100%. That is exactly it. So before we wrap up, I know we were going to only do this in a quick sort of podcast. I just wanted to reflect quickly our own probably experiences and where we found ourselves at, so that it was perhaps you might see yourselves in our experience. So I can definitely sit with this listener who wrote into us from last week's podcast with my first. So I had no friends with babies. So I was 24 when I had Heath. So none of my friends were pregnant or having babies at all. I had no mums who helped us. So both our mums were still working full-time at that point. And I had a pretty fractured relationship with my mum, and I was pretty fucking edgy with my mother-in-law. Like, I actually had a really heartfelt moment with her several months ago or a couple of months ago, where I reflected to her that I've really looked over the course of our relationship, because now I just see actually how extraordinary she is. She still can trigger me, but what I realized is it was more my barriers to her than it had anything to do with who she was or how she is, right? It was just me and my woundedness. And I can see it with such clarity now that I really just wanted, I mean, she's the sweep it under the rug person, so it was a deeply uncomfortable conversation for her. But I was like, I have to tell you this thing.
I'm just going to love it.
Yeah. Because this is who I am. So, I say the things that no one's supposed to say and, aren't politically correct, or no, not politically, but aren't polite, or, that's me. And so anyway, so I said to her, I've realized that the reason why I struggled with you so much, or with our relationship, was because I had never been mothered before. And here was this woman who mothered in this, like, almost overly mothering, like hugely, like just kind of the perfect mother archetype, the too good mother, and who just wanted to wrap you up and, cook and and talk to you every day. And I was like, whoa, back the fuck off, lady. Like, because it was easier to say fuck off than it was to initially feel my, it's almost like the gremlins that protect the gate, isn't it? It's like the initial, like, I can't handle it. Oh, you're so frustrating. Why the fuck did you do that? Which really is just the protective ego of the wound that sat behind that. That was like, fuck, this exists in the world. What would that mean if I saw that, or I let that in? Because I had such an identity built on being a motherless child, really, right?
Yeah.
Anyway, so I reflected that to her, and she, teared up, and then we quickly had to move on, and I just smiled. And it made me think of myself back then as the first. So when I say I had no mother's help, I think she wanted to. But I absolutely was intolerant of having her presence around. And if I could give you any wisdom from my experience of 15 years of parenting, it would be that the relationship that you set up with your first child becomes the relationship, or the set of standards or protocols, or whatever you want to call it, dynamics that will continue for the rest of your life. So I locked her out. I made her know she wasn't welcome here, and neither was her advice, and neither was her opinion, and really neither was she, because I was so irritated by her. And really, I smoothed that over with all my conscious parenting, reasons about how wrong she was. But that was just some fantastic ego protecting, wound protecting, well-cultivated schmoozy language to explain a behavior within me that I felt justified in then, that now I couldn't justify.
God, that's such growth. Fuck.
And the reason I say that is because I wish she was more involved. Like, I wish that I had set a different, I don't know if dependency is the word, but
a different context for your relationship.
Yeah, maybe. I'm trying to work out exactly what the word is, but you can't be super self-sufficient and not need anyone and then be pissed off that they're not helping you. Because you've made it pretty clear you're a self-sufficient island, and whatever you try and do, partners or parents, right, is like disappointing. And frankly, irritating as fuck, maybe even ignorant. That person,
and so that person's not going to continue to, they're not going to continue to show up because you're just meeting their hurt then, and they're going to retreat.
Yeah. So I set up a boundary with her that was pretty much don't come. And look, that's been basically how it's rolled for the rest of my children. Yes, I've changed the way I see her. Yes, we have smoothed and eased, and I've grown in heaps of ways. But had I been more dependent on her to begin with, she probably would have taken on more of a parenting role, because I can see that's their lineage. Like, her mum was deeply involved with my husband and his sister. Like, they almost lived together. And my mother-in-law really would be lucky to see my kids once a term.
That hurt now, thinking like that.
Well, the funny thing is, I mean, the universe abhors a vacuum, right? So whatever space we would have taken up in her life is filled by her other top values. So I don't see that it's a disservice to her either, which, you know, she's going through some pretty major health challenges at the moment, and yet she doesn't need to depend on her children, so my husband and I and his sister and her husband, because she has such a vast and wealthy social life. She has such a vast social network that she has invested in with the same exuberance that she would have invested in her motherhood, that it is paying her back tenfold, to the point where we don't have to parent the parent, even in her time of suffering. There's no void there. So I also don't see it as a disservice. I can feel into my ache, and I
was thinking more about your own hurt about the relationship. Paved the way for her with your children.
Yes,
that relationship.
Yeah, it's a regret for me. So that's why I'm saying in here with, if I could give you any advice. However, me back then, if you were like me back then, so, you know, no friends with babies, no mums who helped, a husband who worked 7 a.m. to 7 p.m, didn't fit in with my locals mothers group, a baby who was fussy, probably had colic, never slept. Like, it was a key recipe for mental health collapse. And I don't think that that's a unique experience at all.
No, I don't think it is.
So me back then, though, was pretty sharp around the edges on what you were allowed to have to enter my world in, and where you were just not welcome. And particularly because of the vastness of my mother wound that I had not remotely reconciled, I just cut her out of my life. Turns out that, you know, what you run from, you run into, and what you bury buries you, right? So here's my version of it. I don't think that I would have listened to me now anyway. I think I would have been too smart. I would have had all the conscious parenting reasons that made her wrong and me right. I wouldn't have listened. I would have argued with you like an intellectual. And I would have made sure that I resourced myself to not need her.
Yeah.
And I can also see, I wonder, you know, sometimes even like, it's a bit of a random, but like Meghan and Prince Harry, you know, how essentially he's removed himself from his family of origin. I watched that and I looked at that and went, fuck, that could have been me, right? So she's just repatterning her family lineage story.
Yeah.
Only now she's roped him into it.
Yeah. And and how much is he going to go on to regret that?
But that could have been me, right? Like, Nick's come from an establishment of well-integrated families, and I haven't. And I pretty much want to tell anyone to fuck off in a parenting structure. So I could have done that. I could have I think the power we have over our husbands particularly, or our lovers particularly, our parents, is enormous, to the point where we can fuck some shit up.
Yeah, it's really, really true. And I think, you know, I think mothers of sons know that.
Yeah, totally, right? So I also at the same time am really grateful for myself that I had enough vision that I knew I had a problem. And I have every year worked on that fucking mother wound every year of my life. And so I can stand here and say I have a really beautiful relationship with my mother-in-law now. But I also have grown children and we're so busy, I also just don't need her either. So it's not the same as it was back then. But back then with baby 1 and 2 and 3, I would have loved help. I would have loved it. But I hadn't set up the framework or the relationship that would support and nourish and flourish that.
Or the softening, because that's what we're really asking our listeners to do is to take a moment to soften into what it might be like to let people in.
Totally. And
what are the reasons why you can't?
Yeah, and letting go of your own self-righteousness. Like, fuck. My sister used to call me, it was the biggest jab she could possibly give me was how self-righteous I was. And I'm just like, I am not. I am like one of the most conscious people I know.
Oh, that's so good.
The shit our psyche comes up with. And now I'm like, oh, I see it.
Now you're just as conscious of your unconscious, right?
So I really wanted to reflect to you that are you able to let people in? Are you able to move past your own projections? Can you feel the love that that person has for your child and go below their surface or your surface in order to feel that intention and move from there? The other thing that I had found along the way that works super well for just communicating and making sure that the time, which is what we had talked about last week, that the time you're having out or with help is of the greatest service and nourishment to you. Because if you are having time with people around and you are not feeling refueled at the end of it, there's something wrong with that. That needs to change.
Yeah, so that you can actually use that as regenerative time, not more taxing time out.
Exactly. So the framework that worked really well for me with my mother-in-law, because we were literally coming from two different worlds. Literally. Well, not literally, but metaphorically.
Like an alien.
No. It felt like it, though. It really did feel like it. Was that I used the framework of when she first arrived, was like, hey, so today I was wondering if you could A, B, and C so that I can X, Y, and Z. That would make me feel so amazing if I could get that done today. And just giving her direction on how I saw her role and what role I wanted her to play, particularly when she entered my space and my home, was wonderful for both of us. And she wanted to contribute to me. She didn't say that, but that was her desire. She wanted to provide something that left me better. So by me saying, can you do these things so that I can do these things, and she could see me doing those things or whatever, that made her feel really good too. So that format of, today can we focus on, today can you ABC so that I can XYZ was a game changer for me. That totally changed, because it wasn't easier or more restorative for me to have her or people, or like to have a mum around me was more triggering and taxing than it was helpful. But as soon as I used that framework, it made it way easier. The other one was often she was better and I was better if I left the house. So either she's come over and she was watching Heath and or Jade and playing with them, and I let her do her thing, be in her world, parent them the way that felt really good for her, and that she didn't feel like I was big brother.
Yeah.
All of the time. And then it meant that I could have deeply restorative time, and I made sure I used that wisely. It meant that I wasn't around the house just cleaning or doing what felt like mundane or meaningless unseen work, that I would go to the library and read a book or listen to music or do some work, or just getting out of the house, I think can be really beautiful. Also, I know that we've touched on this before in a podcast, Bridget, that I think you spoke about, which was, can you love your exhaustion?
Yeah.
Can you love what it brings you, where it takes you, what it offers you?
What it strips back often. Because sometimes when you're exhausted, anything that's, superfluous, drops away, because you can only meet your primary needs and the primary needs of the family.
Totally. So I just wanted to leave you with like our conversation of top values and how many energy cords can you get in one activity, which was, do you know what lights you up? and where your energy comes from. Because it's not true that you're exhausted all of the time and that you're lonely or isolated all of the time. It's not true. There is a counterbalancing moments in your day. When do they happen? What are you doing when they happen? When you're joyful or grateful or filled with purpose and meaning and energy, when you get a zap of energy, when someone says something, when you enter a conversation around this topic, when you do this thing, it's really important. It may or may not be in motherhood.
Yeah. So if it's not, how can you weave it in? How can you, you and I love to like pop the AirPods in and listening to something inspiring, or bring dance into our day, or, beauty, or whatever that is, whatever kind of, brings your life, because our kids want to see the sparkle in our eye. They want to know what the blueprint is to maintain that or to get there. And they see that when we do it for ourselves.
Totally. And as we have said in so many podcasts over the years, energy is infinite when you know its source. If you know what chords you have and when you plug them in, what it gives you, that is the key to your life.
Yeah. 100%.
So go find what those chords are and plug them in. Plug several at once. Amazing.
Yeah. Blow some shit up.
You can't buy a pill on that. You just can't. So please go and do that. And once again, please find your people. I promise they exist, even if you think they don't. It's just my little plug, because I promise they do.
Beautiful.
So, Bridgie, anything you want to leave us with before you take us out?
I think I love the way that you ended that, in terms of looking for where you're not exhausted, looking for where you're not feeling isolated, looking for where you're not lonely, like where there is some connection, and expand into that using the bit of a blueprint that we've outlined here.
So you can connect with us on nourishingthemother.com.au, Nourishing the Mother on Instagram and Facebook. If you have a podcast request, please write to us. We absolutely adore it, and we would love nothing more than to be able to take our answers or this podcast in the direction of where would be most helpful for you. So please reach out.
And to connect with you, Jules,
is julietenner.love. And you, Bridge?
I'm at bridgetwood.life. Remember to nourish the woman to rock the family.
And we'll see you next week when we continue to peel back the layers on your mothering journey.
Thank you so much for listening. We literally couldn't do this without you. Please share this podcast with anyone you think it would be medicine for.
If you desire to integrate your learnings practically and supportively into your life, then head on over to bridgetwood.life or julietenner.love to go deeper.
And if you feel like giving back a little to this free content, please rate us on iTunes or Facebook, all of which helps the podcast reach more mamas who need this type of tonic for the soul.
This has been a production of TheWellnessCouch.com. Check us out on Facebook and join in the conversation on Facebook.com/TheWellnessCouch. Subscribe to each show on iTunes and check us out on Twitter. The Wellness Couch, streaming wellness into your lives.
Whilst the Wellness Couch presenter endeavor to provide accurate and helpful information to their listeners, these podcasts cannot take into account individual circumstances and are not intended to be a substitute for health and medical advice from a qualified health professional. You should always seek the advice of a qualified health professional before acting on any of the information provided by any of the Wellness Couch podcasts.